Now, this evening's presentation is being done by one of our local magic presenters, and that's Jim Caldwell here. Jim is an artist, he's an architect, he's a teacher, he's a great presenter, and he is an art historian. And we are very fortunate to have him presenting part two of the Sistine Chapel presentation.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite artists. Previously, I have presented the entire life and artistic career of Michelangelo, including his sculpture, his paintings, and his architecture. But this time, I'm going to do a deep dive into his stunning achievement on the Sistine ceiling. How many of you have seen the Sistine ceiling? Just about everybody. In the next 45 minutes, I hope to show you parts of the ceiling you did not have time to see, and to give you a better visual understanding of this Michelangelo masterpiece. I love this poignant portrait of Michelangelo done by Fra Bartolomeo when Michelangelo was 42. In 1508, at the height of the Italian Renaissance, Michelangelo was the most famous and celebrated sculptor in Italy, if not all of Europe. He was only 33, and he had already finished two of his greatest masterpieces, the Pietà in Rome and the David in Florence. Architect Bramante, 31 years his senior and nowhere near as famous, was jealous of Michelangelo and wanted to take him down a notch or two. Even though Michelangelo had numerous sculptures on his to-do list, including 40 figures for the tomb of Pope Julius II, Bramante persuaded his friend the Pope to order Michelangelo to come to Rome from Florence and paint the 12 apostles on the ceiling of the important Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is next to St. Peter's Basilica. Here we can see it circled to the right of the basilica. It would be the only building left standing in this complex of buildings. The rest would be a teardown, so that a new St. Peter's could be built by Bramante as the largest church in Christendom. Bramante knew that Michelangelo just wanted to sculpt and hoped that Michelangelo would fail at this fresco. Michelangelo, never afraid to speak his mind, even to the Pope, protested angrily that he was a sculptor, not a painter. But in the end, he decided that he had to accept this commission. This is what the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel looked like in 1508, before Michelangelo started. Gold stars on a light blue sky. Notice that the ceiling is a simple barrel vault with spandrels or triangular shapes cutting into the vault above each of the windows. The walls below the windows had been painted by many famous artists, including this beautiful panel by Botticelli, but they would soon be overshadowed by Michelangelo's transformation of the ceiling. This is an example of what Michelangelo did as a painter before he started the ceiling. Whether or not Bramante knew it, Michelangelo was already a very talented painter, and he also knew the art of fresco, as he had originally apprenticed with a fresco painter, Domenico Ghirlandaio. At age 14, he had been the precocious star of that studio. In this piece, we see Michelangelo's extremely creative rendering of the Holy Family. It is known as the Doni Tondo. Doni was the family which commissioned the painting, and Tondo means round. He chose a round shape to make his focus on the three central figures. It is Michelangelo's only surviving easel painting, and it is in perfect condition. It is beautiful and innovative in so many ways. The rambunctious Christ child is climbing on the shoulder of Virgin Mary with his hands on her head as if to bless her. The concerned Joseph, a much older man, is squatting behind her, his knees wrapping around her like a throne, his left hand on Christ's chest, ready to catch him if he falls. Mary twists around to her right to grab Jesus. Her right arm is supported by Joseph's right knee. Notice Joseph's bare foot next to Mary's right foot and the toes of Mary's left foot peeking out from under the blue fabric in the center. Michelangelo is a master at this complex intertwining of bodies, and this serious portrait of the Holy Family takes on a playful attitude. Look at the fascinating complication of the fabrics in 6 beautiful colors: pink, blue, orange, green, gold, and gray, as they wrap around the figures in elaborate ways. Notice the stunningly beautiful modeling of the three heads bathed in warm reflected light from the right, and Mary's foreshortened left arm. Because of Savonarola's puritanical influence in Florence, Michelangelo could only use male models, so that often his female figures have the musculature of a man. Notice also the unusual angle of Mary's head as she looks up at her adorable curly-haired Christ child. In the middle ground, on the right, is Christ's cousin, the young St. John the Baptist, looking up adoringly. In the background are 5 nude males, the meaning of which has caused much speculation. Do these men represent the sins of man? Some say that the blued-out hills and water in the background were influenced by the atmospheric perspectives of the much older Leonardo da Vinci's background, which Michelangelo had surely seen. But I digress. Remember, this is what he had done before the ceiling. Sculpting was Michelangelo's greatest joy, and he had not done any fresco work since Ghirlandaio's studio 20 years before, but he was confident that he could fresco the ceiling. I think it is very probable that he took on the project thinking that he would do the design and the drawings, and talented fresco painters whom he would hire would do the painting. His ambitions grew immediately, and he decided that he would create the largest painting in the Western world. He took scenes from Genesis in the Old Testament as his theme, knowing that it was rich with possibilities. He would add many allusions to the New Testament as well. He read and reread the Bible several times while he was painting the ceiling. This would be a Bible lesson for those who could not read, which was a large percentage of Romans at the time. After reviewing the work of his assistants, he decided that he would have to do all the painting by himself, with the assistants only doing the plaster work, the pigment preparation, and the scaffolding manipulation. I want to repeat that. Most people assume that much of the ceiling was painted by the assistants. No, he painted the entire ceiling himself. A few words about fresco, meaning fresh. This is the art of painting water-based pigments on a wet plaster surface. The pigments are absorbed into the plaster, bonding chemically with the lime in the plaster and forming an image which is permanent. It is definitely a team effort between those who prepare the plaster and apply it to the surface, to those who prepare the pigments, and the artist who applies the paint. Time is of the essence, as the artist must work quickly while the plaster is still wet. This is a detail of a partial day's work. You can see that the plaster has given the artist a little cushion by extending the day's plaster slightly beyond the figure on the right. The fresco paints are transparent, like watercolors, with white being the color of the plaster. It is an unforgiving medium, as once you have laid down a color, it is almost impossible to change or remove it. It is fascinating to watch a YouTube video of someone actually performing this process. No one knows who invented the technique, but there are beautiful examples of frescoes which are thousands of years old. Here's one from Crete, which was painted 3,000 years before Michelangelo. We shall see that as the months and years went by, Michelangelo's confidence in frescoing skills increased. The last images are far more complex than the first ones. How many square feet did Michelangelo paint? Wikipedia says 6,000 square feet, or roughly the footprint of the chapel. And another website says 12,000. So I decided to do my own calculations. It's a barrel vault. Half the circumference of the circle would be the 46-foot width of the chapel times pi divided by 2 times the length of the chapel, or 9,400 square feet. The Last Judgment on the altar wall was another 2,300 square feet. To put that in perspective, the combination of these two is almost 800 of my largest paintings. This man was driven. Working sometimes 20 hours a day, he read the Bible, did conceptual drawings, design drawings, color studies, full-size cartoons, and painted the ceiling. He needed very little sleep, ate only out of necessity, and he often slept in his clothes. He finished the ceiling in an astonishing 4 years. This was the same time it took him to sculpt the single figure of David. The Last Judgment, which he painted in his 60s, took an additional 7 years with numerous interruptions. Together they include over 600 figures. It is hard to appreciate the thousands of drawings, both big and small, that Michelangelo prepared for this ceiling. To give you an idea of the size of the drawings or cartoons Michelangelo prepared, the prophets and Sibyls are more than twice life-size. It is ironic that the 12 apostles originally requested by the Pope never made it to Michelangelo's ceiling. In 1980, a 14-year restoration took place, uncovering Michelangelo's glorious colors, which had been obscured by 500 years of candle smoke. Michelangelo first had to design and build a scaffolding spanning the 46-foot width of the chapel so that the masses could be performed underneath while the new basilica next door was being built. The scaffolding covered half of the chapel, and it was over 50 feet in the air. Reached by 5 flights of stairs, it was stepped so that it was somewhat uniform distance from the curved ceiling. In this way, Michelangelo could stand upright on the various levels to paint the ceiling. There are no surviving drawings of that scaffolding, so I have taken a shot at what it might have looked like, with 3 figures drawn to scale on the upper levels to give you a sense of the impressive scale. This triangulated wood structure was supported by corbels just below the windows. Imagine carrying 50 pounds of wet plaster up 5 stories. The 1965 movie The Agony and the Ecstasy, based on the book by Irving Stone, perpetuated the myth that Michelangelo painted the ceiling while lying on his back. Take it from me, it is not possible to paint while lying on your back. He painted it standing up, albeit bent over backwards. Michelangelo wrote, "My beard is pointing at heaven, my brain is crushed in a casket. My brush above me at all times dribbles paint so that my face makes a fine floor for the droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight." Unquote. Being in this position for long periods of time played havoc on his posture and his eyesight. When Michelangelo had finished the first half of the ceiling, which includes 3 scenes of Noah plus Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the impatient Pope ordered him to take the scaffolding down. Soon all of Rome was talking about this breathtaking new masterpiece. Because the scaffolding had blocked his view, Michelangelo had not seen the fresco from the floor. He concluded that he had painted too much detail, not visible from 60 feet away. Imagine admiring a painting in a gallery from a distance of 60 feet. This is the Great Flood, which is on the first half of the ceiling. There are many, many small figures fading into the distance. This one is God dividing light from darkness, which is on the second half. The figure of God is big and bold, much more powerful and easier to see from the floor. After the first half was finished, the young prodigy Raphael, who considered Michelangelo to be his rival, tried to persuade the Pope to let him paint the second half of the ceiling. As you can imagine, Michelangelo, basking in the praise of Rome, said not no, but hell no. After his success of the first half of the ceiling, Michelangelo was now known as Il Divino, or the Divine One. Michelangelo's first stroke of genius was to transform the simple barrel vault into something far more complex and interesting, with architectural illusion. With multiple vanishing points, shadowing, and perfect architectural precision, he created a rich spatial illusion of cornices, corbels, and pedestals. Here we have 3 architectural features in perfect perspective, and pairs of putti which appear to be carved in white marble. They fool the eye, but they are just painted on a smooth plaster surface. A putto, singular of putti, is a representation of a naked child, especially a cherub or a cupid. Here are figures in frames which are meant to look like they are painted on a 2-dimensional surface, like portraits. And here are figures which are meant to look like real people projecting from the ceiling, sitting on architectural elements. This combination of 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional illusions is rich indeed. When one enters the Sistine Chapel, one can't help feeling overwhelmed by the sheer visual splendor and magnitude of the ceiling, with its 343 figures in brilliant colors. From a distance of 60 feet, the details tend to blend together in a beautiful decorative mass. Where to begin? We're going to look at the ceiling up close, starting at the east end where he started, so that we can admire Michelangelo's extraordinary creative brilliance and detail. Without opera glasses and more time than one is given in the chapel, this look is impossible. This color diagram makes Michelangelo's organization of the ceiling very clear. The magenta panels in the center are scenes from the book of Genesis. The dark blue panels are the prophets, the light blue are the sibyls, female oracles of Greece. The orange pendentives or spandrels in the corners are stories from the Old Testament. The light yellow curved lunettes over the 14 windows with curved triangular spandrels above them are the genealogy of Jesus from the Old Testament. The small round pink shapes are painted to look like bronze medallions. Michelangelo started painting the ceiling over the entrance on the left and finished over the altar on the right. We are going to follow his progression to see how his frescoing skills improved and evolved over the 4 years it took him to finish the ceiling from left to right. We're going to look at 28, or about half, of these panels in detail, so fasten your seatbelts. We will start with the orange pendentives. This is the one at the corner of the entrance end, and the first one he painted. In the Old Testament, a naked David slays Goliath with a rock from his sling. Michelangelo's version is much more dramatic. David has only knocked Goliath down with a rock and the sling in the foreground, and now he is delivering the coup de grace with a sword he is holding over his head as Goliath struggles to get up. This is a very different David than the naked one Michelangelo had sculpted in Florence only a few years before. The garments which David and Goliath wear are beautiful, and the figure of the twisting Goliath is very convincing. However, the tent behind David is strange, and the figure of a soldier in the back right corner makes no visual sense. The painting of David's head seems a bit tentative. As we shall see, this scene is interesting, but it can't compare with the last ones at the altar end of the ceiling. This is the center panel of the pendentive opposite David and Goliath. It tells the story of Israel being threatened with the destruction by the Assyrians under their chief general Holofernes. Judith, the beautiful and heroic widow in white on the right, manages to get Holofernes drunk and cuts off his head, when he falls asleep, saving Israel from destruction. Judith's attendant is carrying the severed head on a tray which is balanced on her head. Judith looks away from this gruesome sight as she reaches up to cover it. Her complicated dress and unusual hairpiece are beautifully designed. It was quite common for Renaissance artists to include themselves in their paintings, and it is widely assumed that the head of Holofernes is actually one of Michelangelo's self-portraits. Only in his late 30s, when he painted this, Michelangelo was old before his time. Now we will look at the 7 prophets and 5 sibyls, each one more beautiful and complex than the last. The prophets are from the Old Testament. The prophet Zechariah is directly over the entrance to the chapel and is the first one Michelangelo painted. Zechariah presided over the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem the way he now presides over the chapel, which is built to exactly the same dimensions. Zechariah wrote, "Many peoples and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord hosts in Jerusalem and to entreat the favor of the Lord," unquote. He is in fact a portrait of Pope Julius II, who, as we know, was Michelangelo's patron. It was typical at the time to include a portrait of the patron within the artwork. The 2 putti behind him seem to be looking at something behind his back. Zechariah bends the cover of the book back and is riffling through the pages as if looking for some passage. The red, orange, and green colors are quite wonderful. This is a relatively simple composition and pose. We will see that change as we progress towards the altar end of the chapel. I will alternate between the prophets and the sibyls as we may progress towards the altar. The sibyls were female prophets or oracles from the ancient Greece who predicted the coming of Christ. With these sibyls, Michelangelo is recalling the important influence of classical Greece on Christianity and the Italian Renaissance. The Delphic sibyl unwinds a scroll with her left hand as she turns towards the viewer and looks over her shoulder apprehensively. The effect of movement is accentuated by the swirls of the light blue mantle and her curly hair, which is being blown back by the wind. Her left arm raised to her shoulder reminds us of Michelangelo's Doni Tondo. The complication of the child, whose back is turned to us as he reads his own book, is wonderful. The dark animal-like figure peering over that book is quite mysterious. The combination of the red and green and complementary colored drapery is dramatic. In this image, we can see some of the gold leaf on the left, which Michelangelo added after the plaster had dried. Joel is the prophet of the apocalypse. He writes, "The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining." Unquote. This is a portrait of the architect Bramante, who, after all, was the one responsible for Michelangelo's masterful fresco. His face appears to reveal wisdom, disdain, and intense focus all at the same time. He's enveloped in a beautiful red cape, which is in brilliant contrast to the violet tunic, trimmed in green, accented by a white sash. He gazes intently at the scroll as his right arm rests on a lectern. Behind him are two curly-haired putti, the one in shadow mimicking Joel's position, the other, who is carrying a book, points to his companion trying to engage him. This Erythraean Sibyl presided over the Apollonian oracle at the Greek town of Erythrae. She stares pensively, almost trance-like, at the book, the pages of which she is turning as if to finish it quickly. Her bare arms are quite masculine. We feel that we can almost read the text, starting with a decorative Q. One of the putti behind her lights a votive candle with a torch being blown by the wind. The other hides in the shadows. The Sibyl's beautiful braided hair supports an unusual headdress. Look at the wonderful complication of the many layers of fabric covering her crossed legs, in contrast with the simple blue fabric covering the table. In this image, we can see more of the gold leaf which Michelangelo had added. Here is the prophet Isaiah, somewhat feminine, momentarily interrupted from his reading by an adorable puto over his right shoulder. Notice that his finger has kept his place in the book to be finished once the puto is gone. And notice the care with which Michelangelo has painted his bare toes. Also notice his curly gray hair and the cape, which is blue on the outside and green on the inside. Finally, notice the interesting negative space around his left hand. Negative space is a space left over around an object and can be interesting in its own right. The Cumaean Sibyl was a priestess presiding over the Apollonian oracle at Cumae. She foretold the virgin birth of a son who would bring forth a golden age. What an incredibly powerful Amazon-like figure Michelangelo has painted, her knees pressed together. Her wisdom-lined face, seen in profile, is stunningly portrayed. There is such beauty in her ugliness with her flushed cheeks. I love the folds of her white turban and the two putti looking over her shoulder, one of them carrying his own book. Ezekiel was one of the prophets who predicted the virgin birth and prophesied the resurrection of the dead. He said, "Thus says the Lord, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up to heaven." He looks startled as he turns away from the scroll, reaching out his right hand. Has he heard the voice of God? Look at the scroll rolled up in his left hand. The puto, looking over his shoulder, looks distressed. The one on the left with her untamed curly hair points upward like the youthful St. John the Baptist depicted by Leonardo and others. Notice the beautiful long blue scarf wrapped around Ezekiel's shoulders, blowing in the wind, becoming a head covering and the deep folds of the purple drape. The Persian Sibyl was the prophetess of dark destiny and the end of time. We see her face in profile as she looks away from us for a nearsighted peek at her book. Her mouth is open, as if reading aloud to the children behind her in shadow. I love the complexity of the white head wrap and the color of the teal-green garment juxtaposed to the deep red lining of the garment on her right. The teal skirt is tucked in as if she is sitting on it. This is the prophet Daniel. He prophesied the last days, the four world empires, the Antichrist, and the triumph of the universal kingdom. Look at the beauty of his foreshortened bare left arm draped over the book, the small figure between his knees holding up that heavy book, and the child peeking over Daniel's shoulder. He looks away, hair disheveled, furrowed brow, as if troubled by what he reads. His right arm is on a lectern, as if poised to write down a note. A scroll is tucked inside. Notice the stunning combination of yellow, green, alizarin, crimson, and blue on the left, and the orange tassels on the green drape wrapped around his left knee. These tassels, like so many other details, can hardly be appreciated when standing on the floor 60 feet away. Here's the prophet Jeremiah, lost in thought. Look at the detail of his powerful right hand covering his mouth and his beautiful snowy white beard. Some think that this is another self-portrait of a melancholic Michelangelo, although his beard had certainly not turned white when he had painted this in his late 30s. Jeremiah is old and weary, bent over from exhaustion. Unlike the other prophets, he has no books or scrolls, too tired to continue his efforts. He has given up on the people of Israel who have not heeded his warnings. The two figures behind Jeremiah are different than the cherub-like putti who are on with the other prophets. The female on the left is definitely in distress, and the male on the right is a likeness of the priest Savonarola, who had such an evil influence on the arts of Florence. Notice the beautiful detailing of Jeremiah's left hand dangling limp in his lap, and the rich colors of his soft leather boots. He is the only prophet with footwear. Some say that this image of Jeremiah became the model for Rodin's The Thinker some 400 years later. Most of Michelangelo's drawings were lost or intentionally destroyed by him. This drawing of the Libyan Sibyl, my favorite Sibyl, is fascinating for its detailed study of the back muscles, which he ultimately covered with his strikingly modern strapless orange gown. The drawing has the musculature of a male model, but the shoulders he painted are definitely female. Notice the bent position of the right big toe, which Michelangelo had sketched 3 times, and the left hand and face, which he had drawn twice. This gives you an appreciation for the thousands of drawings he did for this ceiling. I love the 2 pair of bas-relief putti in the upper corners and the 2 children beneath her left elbow. One of them wrapped in a curious sleeping bag. The Sibyl lays aside the large and cumbersome open book as if in the process of closing it. The complex serpentine rotation of the young Sibyl, who seems to be about to rise from her seat, is remarkable in its richness and delicacy. Notice the beautiful detailing of the dress at her waist. The dramatic contrast between the bright orange dress and the teal drapery in deep shadow. Look at the beautiful white fabric between her legs and the complexity of her golden braid. And finally, notice the loving care with which he painted the fringe near her left foot, yet another detail invisible from 60 feet away. Compare her to the first Sibyl, and we can see that his confidence in his frescoing skills had grown dramatically. It was the last Sibyl he painted, and her lyric beauty takes my breath away. Here's what Michelangelo's biographer Condivi had to say about the prophet Jonah, the last prophet Michelangelo painted. But admirable above all the others is the prophet Jonah, placed at the head of the vault, because contrary to the form of this part of the ceiling, by force of light and shade, the torso, which is foreshortened so that it goes back away into the roof, is on the part of the arch nearest the eye, and the feet and the legs, which, as it were, project forward and are on the part furthest away. This is a stupendous performance which shows what a marvelous power was in this man of turning lines into foreshortening and perspective, unquote. The curly-haired blonde angel crouched behind Jonah is so tenderly depicted. The giant fish trying to swallow Jonah's left leg is a whimsical allusion to the mythical whale. Notice the complexity of Jonah's 2 hands and the foreshortening of his face as he looks skyward. And the comparison between the first and last prophets is dramatic. The prophets and Sibyls had become larger and larger. This is a tour de force. Now let's have a close look at 6 of the 9 center panels. It is curious that he painted these scenes from Genesis in reverse chronological order, with his last panel being God dividing light from darkness. I will save the creation of Adam for the end. The drunkenness of Noah is the first one Michelangelo painted. We see Noah asleep on a gold-green cloth, shamefully drunk after sampling the new vintage from the wine cask behind him. His son Ham mockingly points at him, while his other 2 sons, Shem and Japheth, avert their gazes. Shem attempts to cover his father with a blued cloth. Another figure of Noah is planting a vine in the background. This scene emphasizes the fall of humankind into sin. While the figures demonstrate Michelangelo's mastery of male anatomy, the colors are somewhat tentative, the flesh tones pale. This panel shows Michelangelo's understanding of the importance of negative spaces. As I mentioned earlier, negative spaces are the spaces left over around an object. Look at the interesting shape of the sky as it wraps around Noah on the left, and the interesting dark negative spaces between the legs of the other Noah and his sons. This scene of the temptation of Adam and Eve and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden is 3 panels later, and is the last one Michelangelo painted before he took the scaffolding down for the first time. The flesh tones are far richer, the colors more vivid. He has shown Adam and Eve twice, packing in the narrative content as he did with Noah. Contrary to Scripture, which has Eve corrupting Adam, Michelangelo's version has Adam grabbing for his own apple of knowledge at the same time Eve is tempted by the serpent. Instead of the apple being in the mouth of the serpent, it is in the hand of a woman who is coming out of the huge serpent's body. Eve is no longer the scapegoat for their fall from grace. The symbolism of a female tempting another woman is fascinating. A brilliant red angel expels the other Adam and Eve from the garden as she pokes Adam with her sword. The consequences of their sins are evident as Adam has been transformed into an old and haggard man, and Eve is transformed from beauty into ugliness. The road ahead of them will be filled with difficulties. Look at all the interesting negative spaces of the sky and the tension created by Adam's right hand as he almost touches the angel. The creation of Eve is the first panel of the second half of the ceiling, right next to the Garden of Eden. Having seen the fresco from the floor for the first time, as I have mentioned, Michelangelo decided to greatly simplify the designs of the second half. Here he has gone from 6 figures to 3, and they are pressing all 4 edges of the image. The top of God's head is actually cut off by the edge of the panel. This is also the first time Michelangelo has shown God actually standing on the earth. God summons Eve from the sleeping body of Adam, and she looks directly into his eyes. She has the stature of Adam, and she comes forth as a strong person who is in no way subservient to Adam. Adam dispenses with the rib theory of Eve's creation. Again, he creates a point of tension between the tips of Eve's fingers and God's right arm. This is the first time he has painted a dead tree, and it symbolizes the cross upon which Jesus will be crucified. It has been suggested that the figure of Adam crumpled against his tree is prefiguring Christ. This is one of Michelangelo's many allusions to the New Testament. It is curious that he did not bother to get the horizon level. There is no description of God's appearance in the Bible. Michelangelo has created an entirely new image of God, an older man with a long white beard. This became the standard image of God in the Western world after the Sistine ceiling. This scene of the separation of earth from the waters is very dramatic, with 3 young angels wrapped in a beautiful red cape attempting to hold up God as he looks down upon the green ocean. The right angel looks over his shoulder at the scene below. God's foreshortened right arm with outstretched hand is particularly beautiful. The creation of the sun and the moon and the planets is the last large panel which Michelangelo painted. The huge glowing sun near the center of the composition is so bright that the angel behind God is shielding her eyes. The red cape in the last scene is broken open to reveal a stern God in all his glory, arms outstretched, fingers pointing in the act of creation. The angel on the left looks up at God in awe. The 2 angels under his left arm are swept up in the action. The moon on the right, reflecting the radiance of the sun, is an emblem of the Virgin Mary. The meaning of the second figure of God floating off to the left is unclear, but we love the soles of his feet, his buttocks, and his outstretched right arm. This spandrel at the altar end of the ceiling is one of the last panels Michelangelo painted. God tells Moses that he who looks at the bronze serpent, seen in the background wrapped around the post, will be saved from the snakes which are biting them. On the left are the saved, and on the right are the damned. This scene is extremely complicated, with many twisting bodies and lots of beautifully subtle colors. In this detail, we can see several snakes wrapping around the contorted figures in the foreground. Look at the complication of the 5 heads all crushed together, each in his own state of agony, and the twisted arm trying to free himself of the snake. Michelangelo's creative powers of composition and foreshortening and mastery over anatomy are in full stride. In this scene, probably the last one Michelangelo painted, he is depicting a very complex narrative involving a prideful Haman who was crucified on a gibbet, or gallows-like structure on which criminals were hanged after they were executed. Haman had prepared this gibbet for his enemy Mordecai, who had refused to bow down before him. Mordecai is in a red tunic sitting in the doorway. In a yellow tunic above him is Esther, who had been warned of of Haman's treachery, by Mordecai of Haman's treachery. On the right is the king Ahasuerus in his bedchamber as he points to Haman, who had planned to kill all of the Jews. The door frame and the 2 figures within it on the curving plaster ceiling is an extremely ambitious compositional element. The figure of Haman, his arms severely foreshortened, his legs spread as if he were running, is a spatial tour de force. The common theme of these last 2 spandrels is sin and its punishment rather than virtue and its reward. Some have speculated that this reflects Michelangelo's state of mind at the time. Look at the dramatic difference in the compositional complexity, the foreshortening, the perspective, the display of male anatomy between the first and last of Michelangelo's spandrels. On the lunettes and spandrels above the windows, Michelangelo painted the genealogy or ancestors of Jesus as recorded in the book of Matthew. The Bible says that there were 42 generations which preceded Christ, but there is very little information about the individuals. We will look at just 2 spandrels and 2 lunettes. I will dispense with the names, which don't really mean much to us in the grand scheme of things. These are mostly intimate family groupings. Michelangelo painted them very quickly and dispensed with the full-size cartoons, which he had done for other figures, painting freehand directly on the wet plaster. The small curved triangular panels above the windows or spandrels were a compositional challenge, as he painted the figures mostly and he painted the figures mostly seated so that they could be as large as possible. In this one, Michelangelo has painted 3 generations intimately connected. The father whispers into his daughter's ear. The mother, leaning back against the frame with her swollen breasts, appears to be still nursing the chubby child, who glances at us suspiciously over his shoulder. This spandrel has such a pleasingly warm color scheme. It appears to be a mother and father with their sleeping son twisted into his mother's lap. The father looks like he has just woken up, looking at the child with affection. She looks apprehensive. Is that another child behind the father? The 14 lunettes were the only surfaces Michelangelo painted which were vertical, and therefore much easier to paint. As I mentioned, he painted them freehand. He did not spend more than a few days on each one. Here are 2 infants trying to communicate with each other, one held by the seemingly frightened mother, the other held by his more confident father. Notice the care with which Michelangelo painted the fringe on the father's shawl. This lunette has 2 family groupings. The one on the left is an angry, suspicious old man hunched over with his daughter behind him, trying to calm him. The family on the right has a beautiful mother with an exotic headdress and beautiful multicolored gown, looking at us flirtatiously. The father behind her seems to be managing the 2 rambunctious children. Michelangelo painted 10 pairs of nude male figures in the corners of the 5 smaller panels in the center of the ceiling. He called them ignudi, or naked, and their meaning is unclear. Let's look at 3 of those pairs. The mastery of the nude body was an essential measure of achievement of any artist in the High Renaissance, and clearly Michelangelo was showing off his skills. Each ignudi has a distinctly different pose. Some say that these are angels without wings, embodiments of the divine spirit, and the agents of God. Michelangelo has not depicted wings on any of the angels in the ceiling. These 2 ignudi are sitting on soft golden cushions, and their wind-blown capes begin to resemble wings. They both look over their shoulders as if responding to some external force. It is hard to remember that the round bronze plaque between them, representing Alexander the Great, kneeling before the high priest outside the city of Jerusalem, is just paint on a flat plaster surface. The nude on the left has strong, long, curly hair and a feminine face with a suggestion of breasts, even though we are told that all of the nudity are male. We cannot see his or her genitalia. His or her cape is ballooning in the wind. The pose of the right-hand nude is particularly dramatic, with the musculature of his wide, powerful shoulders carefully delineated. His open mouth and wind-blown hair communicate high emotion. Notice the curling toe of his left foot. We can't see his right leg, but he appears to be a bit off balance as he leans back against a green bolster which is falling off the pedestal. These last ignudi highlight oak garlands and huge acorns. The oak represents Christ's cross, the acorns, the food of the golden age. The figure on the left, with his right foot tucked behind his left knee, his left arm resting on his right knee, seems to be at peace. The right figure, however, with his exceptionally massive torso bent over, strains and bulges in a tense display of counterbalanced parts. Notice the beauty of his foreshortened right elbow thrusting into space as he reaches back to grab the oak garland. The great art historian Kenneth Clark wrote that their physical beauty is an image of divine perfection. Their alert and vigorous movements are an expression of divine energy. Art historian Lauren Partridge says, quote, Michelangelo has in this last bay reached the absolute limits of anatomical variation and perfection, creating nudes that embody more Herculean power and Apollonian refinement than ever before, nudes that are the consummate expressions of angelic grace. I will finish with this scene of God, held up by a dozen angels as he gives the spark of life to Adam. It is the most reproduced of all of Michelangelo's images. The angels are contained in a billowing maroon cape. In contrast is the beautiful diaphanous green fabric which begins on the knee of an angel in the center and wraps around behind God. Notice the curly blonde hair of the angel under God supporting most of his weight on her shoulder. And notice the left hand of God resting on the shoulder of an angel. I particularly love the angel tucked into the crook of God's left arm as she looks towards Adam with apprehension. Look at the loving exchange in the eyes of God and Adam and the tension of the two hands as they almost touch. This is such a lyrical composition. I'm fascinated by the downward sweep of the landscape behind Adam juxtaposed to the upward curve of Adam's body. Is that water rushing down the hillside? Notice the negative space of the white sky as it zigzags around the legs of the angels and the maroon cape of God. This iconic image of God giving the spark of life to man is so personal that it touches all who see it. The Sistine ceiling made the sculptor Michelangelo immediately famous as a fresco painter. This led to a demand for other large frescoes for the Pope, including the Last Judgment on the altar wall, which he painted 25 years later for Pope Clement VII. As a reminder, this is where Michelangelo started, and this is where he finished. His contemporary biographer said, Michelangelo was favored by the Almighty as a man perfect in every aspect of art and poetry, designed to inspire others to follow his artistic example. As it was God who brought life to man, it was Michelangelo who immortalized man's existence in paint and marble. Even though Michelangelo steadfastly insisted throughout his entire life that he was a sculptor, not a painter, and not an architect, his gift to the world of the Sistine ceiling is arguably his greatest achievement. It is the largest painting ever completed by a single artist and visited and admired by over 500,000 people every year. I hope that I have surprised you with images that you had not seen before, and I hope that if you see the Sistine ceiling again, you will see it with a deeper understanding of this extraordinary work of art. Michelangelo died at 89, outliving his rival Raphael by 53 years and outliving 6 popes, producing a body of work probably never to be equaled again. From the Pietà to the Sistine ceiling to the Dome of St. Peter's, superlatives seem wholly inadequate to describe the creative genius that was Michelangelo. Thank you.